Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday the 13th. I'm hopeful that you have finished reading Persuasion by this point. As you have found, it is a slow moving text. It actually is the slowest moving text of the semester, perhaps because it gives us a peek into the lives of the rich and privileged. And one of the attendance questions that I had asked was about whether or not, based on your reading, would you want that kind of life? And certainly, while it comes with a certain level of comfort and privilege, it also comes with a certain level of boredom and basically a lack of depth. And that's one of the things that the author was trying to show us. What we will see as the semester progresses is that our authors become much more radical in terms of their statements about society as a whole and also about the role of female in society. Persuasion, as I had indicated before, is very much like a soap opera, so keeping track of the characters is of importance. And the text is basically a satire and a critique on inherited wealth, but we also get a romance story as well. As you know, I had indicated that we're approximately a class behind or so I have given an extension on the journal. So the Persuasion Journal, some of you have already submitted it. Thank you very much. But the Persuasion Journal will be due on the 13th, Tuesday. If you are watching this video on Tuesday, that would be today, by 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. Be very similar to what you did with your first journal about Frankenstein, thinking about a page or so response, but as long or as short as you'd like it to be. I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. View it as a kind of conversation on paper, and I evaluate it on a checkmark system, with the plus being excellent and a check plus being very good and a check being satisfactory. And usually that's where the grades fall. There is a lesson satisfactory and unsatisfactory as well. And that means that there will also be an extension for the paper, at least according to our syllabus. And certainly you can follow the syllabus in terms of due dates if you'd like. Your first paper would be due on the 15th of June, which would be this upcoming Thursday, also at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email. But I've given an extension up until Tuesday the 20th, so that if you needed the weekend in order to construct your first paper, then certainly I have no difficulty with that. Do keep in mind, though, that the semester is moving quite quickly. And the good news, however, is that once we get past Jane Eyre, the readings go much faster. And even though Jane Eyre is a very long text, it also is an action-filled text. So I think that you'll find that despite its length, it is quite different from the slow-moving classical sentences that we've become accustomed to in Persuasion. This was the author's attempt to persuade us that this lifestyle is rather vacuous and rather meaningless. That's not to say that we don't have biases, just like we had biases in Frankenstein. But we know a little bit about the Elliot family and how important decorum and appearances are for Sir Walter Elliot, and basically for anyone in this social class. And we see this right at the very beginning of the novel when he's looking at the Bartonage. A Barton or a baron would be the lowest order of British nobility. And he basically is trying to see where he fits in terms of British nobility, and is he able to improve his status through his children. And we know that he doesn't have a direct male heir anymore, which changes everything in terms of where he is in relation to status. You might have noticed that there are many references to mirrors in this text. Not only is this about physical appearance that Sir Walter is obsessed with, but what we've got is Persuasion is basically showing us a mirror of the upper classes. And we learn a little bit about Lady Elliot in the first book. Notice that Persuasion is divided up into 2 books. And one quote I wanted to read to you about Lady Elliot, that she had humored or softened or concealed Sir Walter's failings, and, though not the very happiest being in the world herself, had found enough in her duties, her friends, and her children to attach herself to life. I can't help thinking about the cult of true womanhood and how woman should basically subvert her needs to the family. And I think that's a great quote illustrating that. We know that she has been dead for 13 years, 13 being a rather ominous number. And because of that, she wasn't there to temper Sir Walter's spending. And again, it almost reminds you of the cult of true womanhood, about how the role of female was to prevent men from falling to moral degradation. In this instance, Sir Walter fell into financial degradation, or difficulty at the very least. It depends on how you define financial difficulty. I suggest you keep this text in mind when we read a text such as Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which had occurred around the same period, but it is a very different kind of environment. So being able to compare and contrast the two, I think is quite interesting. And this said, we'll see that class plays a role for, or socioeconomic class plays a role for female just as much as gender during this time period. And of course, there's always intersectionality and lots of connections between these different cultural groups and identities. But at any rate, we know that from Sir Walter's perspective, he's no longer able to maintain his appearance of having a certain amount of wealth and comfort. He still has the family name, but he doesn't necessarily have the money. So that's the conflict that we're introduced to at the very beginning of the book. So we're also introduced to his 3 daughters. Elizabeth is 29, and she's the lady of the house. And because her mother is not there to basically serve as the lady of the house, there isn't great concern, at least at this point, that she hasn't married. But certainly by the time a woman reached her late 20s, she was considered to be, quote, past her bloom, unquote. And that's something that we see with Anne, who is the middle daughter and the most sensible of all of the family members. We're not really supposed to like any of the Elliots here. Anne, the middle daughter, being 27, unmarried, and in theory has lost her youthful bloom, so it's quite uncertain as to whether or not she's going to be able to find a suitable mate. And suitable would be somebody who is of the same or better socioeconomic class and financial standing. And then the middle daughter, the youngest daughter, Mary, she is, quote, merely, unquote, married to a respectable family with fortune, not nobility. So those are 2 separate things, having money and having nobility. And of course, you want to try to have both, if at all possible. So we know that Mary is married, and in fact, there's a little bit of romantic intrigue in here because her husband had once courted Anne, and she turned him down for marriage proposal. So you can imagine some of the tension going on. Mary's a great example of the role that female was supposed to play during this time period. She always thinks of herself as ill-used, this idea of being rather weak and needing lots of attention. So there are anxieties about social class in this text, and specifically about how, quote, persons of obscure birth could be brought into undue distinction. One of the ways that could happen is through the fear of the Navy or the military, that someone through their own efforts rather than through their birthright could achieve a certain level of status. So the Elliot family, and trying to maintain their status, they concoct this story that they're going to be vacationing in Bath, which was a popular holiday spot. And that ultimately, because they're going to be gone for so long, they're willing to rent out their hall, Kellynch Hall, but only to the correct to the correct persons. And of course, it would have to be somebody who is respectable, but not more respectable than Sir Walter, so that he can maintain his sense of superiority. Because of this, when the family vacations, Anne stays behind and stays with her younger sister Mary and their family. This is an opportunity for Anne to basically leave the Elliot family and to spend more time with the Musgroves, because Mary's in-laws live nearby, and we can see, as well as she can see, that the Musgroves live very differently than the Elliots. So in some ways it's a very eye-opening experience for Anne. And Anne is actually treated as a trustworthy confidant, somebody who is respected and liked, something that's quite different than what occurs in her own family. So this allows Anne to begin to regain her bloom, and she is appreciated, and dare I even say, even is shown affection. The Musgrove family are so different from the Elliots because they have hobbies and interests. So they aren't just wasting their time, let's say, with social activities, though of course the Elliots would never see it as wasting their time, but they do have to find ways to basically fill their day. And that's one of the messages in this text, is that one should keep busy with activity. And also, they allow their daughters a certain level of freedom, Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove, that they can court and marry their own choices, rather than marrying for status or wealth, or even if they are on some level marrying for status and wealth, and they probably are because they are products of their environment. The parents are not going to interfere with their choices. And of course, this is one of the conflicts that we find out about in the past, that Anne was very much in love with Frederick Wentworth, and he was in love with her, but he had not achieved status or fortune, so she turns down his proposal. She ends up regretting that since that moment. She was persuaded by others not to accept because he hadn't achieved that level yet. And his return into Anne's social circle with status and with wealth is something that she has to contend with, as she sees him courting eligible females. And of course, there's a good amount of jealousy there. Again, think about that kind of soap opera subtext, if you will. So as the Musgroves continue to rely on Anne, and Anne begins to recapture her bloom, we find out that the Musgroves are connected to Frederick Wentworth through their dead naval son, Richard, who's referred to as Poor Richard. Again, this is about Navy, and their son was in the Navy, and Frederick Wentworth was working with their son. Keep in mind, this was a rather small social circle, and especially with some of the limitations associated with transportation. So it's perhaps not that much of a stretch, certainly not as much of a stretch as finding a satchel of books in the forest, which we saw with Frankenstein. But again, we have to suspend perhaps a little bit of disbelief that it just so happens that the Musgrove family happens to know Frederick Wentworth. What we do see are lots of falls, whether they be literal falls, characters literally falling down, which we see with little Charles Musgrove. This happens to be Anne's nephew. He falls and dislocates his collarbone, and of course she has to care for him. We get these long quotes about how ultimately the parents don't necessarily want to stay behind and do that. They want to meet Frederick Wentworth, who is new to town now. They've heard so much about him. And that perhaps Anne is best suited because she's family, yet she doesn't have the connection of parent or the connection of mother, or so her sister says. And her sister laments the fact that the father can go off and basically not be held responsible for child caring in the way that she would be. And there is a certain level of truth to that as well, and how unfair that is. But we see also this whole text is about falling in love. And think about the idea of falling, something that's out of our control, something that can hurt, something that's perhaps even deadly. And this is also about station, because we see how Sir Walter Elliot, while he hasn't fallen in station, he certainly has fallen in terms of finances. We're introduced to a very modern couple in this first book, Mr. and Mrs. Croft. They are from the military, so this is an Admiral Croft. They married for love, which would be unusual for the time. And they also have no children, which would be extremely unusual for the time. So their union is for themselves, not necessarily for keeping up to social standards. And they believe that the worst thing in a marriage is separation. They're the closest we're going to see to an equal partnership in the novel. Of course, the major excitement, which might not seem terribly exciting for us, is that after Wentworth has arrived, everyone is going to go visit his friends in Lyme, the Harvilles. The Harvilles are very similar to the Musgroves in that they aren't as pretentious, they aren't as arrogant, they're much more down to earth. And of course, this gives an opportunity for everyone to do something different because they've got lots of hours of leisure on their hands. They don't work, they are part of the landed gentry. And also, it gives the single individuals an opportunity to meet potential partners. Now, one of the things that begins to develop over the course of the text is this possible partnership, romantic partnership, that is, between Frederick Wentworth and Louisa Musgrove. And he's very attracted to Louisa, in part because she seems to be very strong-willed and not easily persuadable, the exact opposite of what Anne was. And while there are long passages about how much he admires this, at one point she is actually walking across a wall and loses her balance and falls. Again, this idea of falling is something that we see throughout the text. And it also shows the importance of balance. You want to avoid the extremes of being too easily persuadable, but also not being so steadfast in one's own impulsivity, and that means that someone becomes careless. So while Louisa seems to show that she doesn't have that balance because she's gone to the extreme. She's literally lost her balance, but she's also figuratively lost her balance. This is something that Wentworth appreciates or learns to appreciate, and that initially he was attracted to Louisa because she was so strong-willed, unlike Anne, but now he sees that being too strong-willed is just as bad as not being strong-willed enough. She's recuperating at the Harville house, which leads to us moving into the second book in Persuasion, where we finally return to Sir Walter. If you remember, this is how we began the text, with Sir Walter. They've been vacationing at Bath, or under the pretense of, wanting to basically meet new people and socialize, but the reality is that they are trying to save some money. They're cutting back on expenses. And then the family cousin, Mr. William Elliot, returns. He was someone who was estranged from the family because of a social slight. Notice that he does not have nobility. He's merely a mister. He is an attorney, and he is a widower, and it turns out that he has a good amount of wealth, but the idea is that he doesn't necessarily have position in society, which we learn later on as the text progresses, that that's the one piece that he's trying to achieve. Notice again that we're filled in a world of widows and widowers, not necessarily divorcees, which gives a telling sense into the time period that we're in. And of course, when you've got somebody like Sir Walter Elliot, the concern is that he will remarry, and that if he has heirs, then that could completely throw off the family dynamic. Specifically for Mr. William Elliot, that means that he wouldn't be the heir presumptive anymore. So he has great concerns, perhaps, about what's going on with Sir Walter Elliot. And think about the idea of how Anne also sees a kind of a mother figure, and yet another widow, a widow who hasn't remarried, probably because she has status and she has financial security. So there would be less of a need for her to remarry. Sir Walter, as long as he's got an oldest daughter who's taking care of the running of the household, perhaps doesn't need to remarry, but certainly this isn't going to be a situation that will last forever. So what we see is when Mr. Elliot returns back into the family circle, of course, since he is not married or he's a widower, he's a possible match. And Anne at this point is getting out in the world and is being appreciated. Definitely her physical beauty is being rejuvenated along with her emotional awakening. And we get to the point where Captain Benwick, Mr. Elliot, and Frederick Wentworth are all interested in Anne, her second bloom, so to speak. We're also introduced to a Viscountess Dalrymple, who's superior in status to Sir Walter. Throughout the novel, we oftentimes see how Sir Walter treats those that are beneath him, or those he considers beneath him, not very well is the answer for how he treats them. But in this instance, we see how he acts towards people who are above him. And Anne talks a little bit about how she's ashamed about how easily it is that he is manipulated by some of the mores of status in society. We know that Mr. Elliot is trying to impress Anne because he's hoping for a union. And of course, one of the benefits would be that would mean that he would be guaranteed, probably, unless Sir Walter married again, he would be guaranteed of the family fortune because he would be married to one of the daughters. So it wouldn't be heir presumptive anymore. As long as there weren't any heirs produced by Sir Walter, then it would make his transition into the Elliot family oh so much easier. And not that unusual, again, for cousins to marry during this time period, especially in terms of social status and trying to maintain particular position or improve particular position. And of course, Sir Walter is trying everything he can do to impress the Viscountess, which again embarrasses Anne very much. In fact, she says she was ashamed of her family, preferring instead, quote, the company of clever, well-informed people who have a great deal of conversation, rather than people who are concerned with birth, education, and manners. That said, and I think somebody had brought this up actually in one of the discussion forum questions, would Anne have ended up with Frederick Wentworth if he had not went and achieved his worth, so to speak, in terms of status and in terms of finances? And while we don't know, my suspicion is the answer would be no. That even Anne, as progressive as she seems, would only go so far in terms of being able to marry outside of her social station. Of course, she's seen as rather progressive because, if nothing else, she's willing to defy the expectations of her family, and that's no small order. We saw that with Safie and Frankenstein as well. But certainly, we see elements of Anne. Even she herself admits that at one point, after Sir William Elliot proposes to her, she's tempted to say yes, she could be the lady of the house, she could be Lady Elliot, but she realizes that that would be a rather empty existence, and that's not what she wants. One of the ways that we see how Anne is progressive is because she maintains a friendship with a Mrs. Smith, who was Anne's former classmate, but Mrs. Smith, notice she's a Mrs., she doesn't have position, is now a poor, infirm, helpless widow, which was the negative side of becoming a widow if there wasn't money. And there's this long, convoluted story that there is some inheritance, but Mrs. Smith, of course, can't act for herself because she's a woman, and there's no one to act for her. Therefore, she is in a very sad state, but that doesn't stop Anne from maintaining a friendship with her. Of course, one of the things that we see in this novel is the idea of hypocrisy, because Sir Walter is spending time with the Mrs. Clay, and in fact, so is Elizabeth. Mrs. Clay also being a widow. And though Mrs. Clay maintains that she knows her station, but the concern is that she's trying to find a way to worm into Sir Walter Elliot's life so that she could perhaps marry Sir Walter and have his income, his financial standing. So, one of the things that I had mentioned earlier is that Anne is tempted to marry William Elliot and become Lady Elliot of Kellynch Hall, as you can see in the notes below under the second section for Persuasion, Volume 2. But resists because he, quote, wasn't rational, just because he was rational, discreet, polished, but he was not open. And as the text progresses, we find out how it is that he wasn't open. Again, things will fall together, perhaps a little bit too neatly. Captain Benwick, who is one of the friends of the Harville family, he was going to marry Harville's sister, Fanny. She died, so he's in mourning. And the question is, when will he leave mourning so that he can find a suitable match, which he does with Louisa. And one of the things that Anne critiques is that he doesn't seem to really be that steadfast to his previous fiancée, that he's able to move from mourning so quickly to find a new mate. It's one of the things that we're supposed to see as a positive for Frederick and Anne towards the ending of the novel, is that they've each waited for one another, or they've waited for enough time to find somebody comparable, that it wasn't just about making a good match or a marriage of convenience. It was also a marriage of affection, and dare I even say, love. And Wentworth even makes a comment about this, and he says, a man should not recover from such a devotion of the heart to such a woman. He ought not, he does not. So even Wentworth thinks that Captain Benwick has moved too quickly in this instance. What we find out, this again convoluted story, is that Mrs. Smith, Anne's friends, was actually friends with Mr. Elliot, or he was friends with her husband before he passed away. And it was Mr. Elliot who brought her husband to financial ruin, which is why she doesn't have any money now, and she's poor and infirm. That basically they spent too freely in order to maintain appearances, even though they weren't in the position to do so, and that Mr. Smith was not even aware of how bad the financial situation was before he died, and now Mrs. Smith has to live with the consequences of that, and has asked Mr. Elliot, as an important male in her life, if he would help her with gathering the inheritance that she has, which would allow her to be somewhat financially comfortable. And he refuses to do so, which shows how selfish and self-centered he is. Mostly not for any real ill intent, it's just he doesn't want to be bothered. All of this comes about through Mrs. Smith sharing a series of letters with Anne. Keep in mind the epistolary novel, which we had talked about with Frankenstein, and how often information is told through letters. Henrietta, the other Musgrove daughter, ends up marrying Charles Hayter. Of course, there was some question about this because Charles Hayter wasn't necessarily of the highest rank or status, but he was going into the ministry and would probably be able to achieve a certain level of rank and status eventually. That's part of the elements in the text as well, is that one doesn't necessarily have to be financially or socially set in order to have marriage, which would have been seen as a rather radical notion at the time, at least for this social and economic set. And Mrs. Croft, remember, she's married to a Mr. Croft in this very contemporary kind of marriage with no children, that's purely for love, says, I'd rather have young people settle on a small income at once and have to struggle with a few difficulties together than be involved in a long engagement. Of course, and that was something that we saw with Fanny Harville, is that she was involved in a long engagement when ultimately she passed away. And it wasn't that unusual for people to die rather young at the time. Tuberculosis was a major illness at the time, something that we will see when we talk about Jane Eyre and also Emily Dickinson as well. So that said, Anne has a very interesting quote towards the ending of the novel where she says that men have the advantage of us, she's talking about women, in telling their own story. And I think that's something that's really important in terms of the themes that we are covering over the course of the semester, that we are talking about female authors who are able to tell their own stories, which would have been unusual for the time period. Anne goes on and says that all the privilege she can claim for her own sex is that of loving the longest, when existence or when hope is gone. And Anne continues and says, if I was wrong in yielding to persuasion once, remember that it was to persuasion exerted on the side of safety, not of risk. That's a little dig there against Henrietta, who fell off that wall. If I was right, I'm sorry, not Henrietta. That was a little dig there to Louisa, who fell off that wall. Remember that it was to persuasion exerted on the side of safety, not of risk. I was right in submitting to her. She's talking about Lady Russell, who, again, as a widow, has not remarried because she has a certain level of wealth and she has a certain level of financial standing, and she serves as a kind of mother figure for Anne. And notice how often we see motherless children, and we will see this over and over again as we continue on in the semester. Nothing that I planned, it's just a theme that seems to be prevalent in many of the major female authors of this time period. But as Anne continues, if I was right in submitting to Lady Russell, if I had done otherwise, I would have suffered more in continuing the engagement than I did even in giving it up, because I should have suffered in my conscience. So I guess this is about as far as we can go for Anne and her sense of autonomy and independence in a society that didn't give autonomy or independence for female. And we hear at the ending, the plot twist is that Mrs. Clay and Mr. Elliot have become a couple, rather unlikely pairing perhaps, but they're both single and they both have similar temperaments. They're both known to be perhaps somewhat shady characters. So maybe it wasn't that unusual that they would end up together after all of these other possible matches have deteriorated, with our happy ending that Anne and Frederick Wentworth are going to marry. And it turns out Frederick Wentworth, as male savior, will assist Mrs. Smith in her inheritance, and that means that she will have a certain level of financial stability. And while Anne might never be completely accepted by her own family, the Elliots, she has created her own. Lady Russell certainly respects and loves her and really only wanted to do what was in Anne's best interest, though not realizing that by trying to persuade Anne not to marry Frederick Wentworth at the beginning of the novel, she was hurting rather than helping. And of course, Anne has Frederick, and she has all of his friends in the military. So now Anne is going to be in a completely different environment, one in which people earn their positions of status and they earn their positions of financial security. They just aren't born into them. Again, I ask you to keep this in mind when we are reading something like Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. It's hard to believe that actually both could be occurring during the same time period, that you've got slavery going on right around the same time that you've got such wealth and such privilege that basically one's life is centered around dinner parties and appearances. But that's exactly what was the situation. So, in terms of persuasion, my attendance question for today, which would be due by Thursday at 9 a.m., though certainly if you need an extension, please ask me and I'll be happy to give it to you. I've identified a few quotes. I wanted you to identify a quote that you thought was interesting in the text and talk a little bit about some of the reasons why. Could be one of the quotes I identified, or it could be another quote. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn, which would give you an idea of some of the class conversation that we would have had. And then we can finish up with persuasion, any odds or ends that we didn't get to next class, and then move on to Jane Eyre. And as I had indicated, Jane Eyre is a long text. It's the longest of the texts. In fact, I will have a video production to recommend to you. Not that watching a video is in any way a substitute for reading the text. It's a complement to reading the text. But I think what you will find right from the very beginning, that Jane Eyre, which happens to be one of my favorites, by the way, is just a great book. Pay attention to names. They will be particularly important. That's the only hint I'm going to give you here. And what we're going to see is a very modern woman in many ways. Much more so than anything we saw with Anne Elliot, and certainly much more so than anything that we saw with Frankenstein as well. So that's not to say that we aren't also going to have romance embedded in Jane Eyre, which is the case. and also a bit of a mystery. They're Gothic elements, which we had talked about with Frankenstein, that we will also see in Jane Eyre as well. So again, for your attendance question is to identify a quote from Persuasion that you find to be interesting and briefly talk about some of the reasons why. I look forward to receiving your journal if I haven't already done so. And I'm hopeful that you are in the midst of reading Jane Eyre and also working on your first paper. So I hope you are doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class talking about Jane Eyre and also paper number 1. Take care. Bye-bye.